What's up, Eager to Pleasers? Welcome back to another episode of the Eager to Please podcast. I know I've said it before, but it's true. Our guests have been nothing short of amazing, and this month is no exception. I am absolutely thrilled that I have the privilege of introducing our next guest, who's here to share her thoughts on anger and resentment. Gemma Hartley is an accomplished freelance journalist, hands-on writing mentor, and acclaimed author of the book Fed Up: Emotional Labor, Women, and the Way Forward, with another book on the way that I hope she'll be willing to spill some juicy details later. Gemma, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me. I am a huge fangirl.
Thanks for having me, Natalie. I'm glad we were finally able to get this together. After writing the next book, I'm really happy to be able to be face to face with people again and start coming out of my cave of writing.
Absolutely. Me too. Oh, and did I mention she's also a mom of three, a wife, the budgeter, trip planner, calendar keeper, homework checker, laundry folder, chauffeur extraordinaire, Christmas card sender. The list goes on, and I need a breath. So I throw that out there as somewhat of a joke. Haha, funny, not funny, because that's where my life was just a few years ago. So I definitely want to dig into this a lot further. But before we do, I wanted to share with our listeners how the two of us got connected in the first place. Shortly after my divorce, something was pushing me to start reading more. So thanks to my local library and the Dewey Decimal System, I was perusing the shelves in the psychology and self-improvement sections when I came across this title in bright red letters called Fed Up. And I don't know if there could have been a more obvious sign put right in front of me, because at the time, those two words encapsulated everything I had been feeling about my life and my marriage, that I quickly pulled the book from the shelf and started skimming the pages. Didn't take me long to realize that this was a book I needed to take home with me. So I hit the self-checkout line, anxiously drove home, and began diving in, which is when I found your socials and website. And on there, you had this contact form, which totally out of character for me. I never reach out on those things because I automatically assume this person is on a higher level, untouchable, so to speak, and that they would never want anything to do with responding to fan mail. But I did it anyway because I knew I was starting the podcast, and I knew how much reading your book changed my life and helped me realize that this invisible problem that I was wrestling with and couldn't find a name for the longest time was an actual thing. I had no idea that plenty of other women felt the same way that I had been dealing with all these years. And so here you are talking about emotional labor, and I couldn't be more grateful to have you as a guest sharing your thoughts.
Well, thank you for having me. And also, I will say, if there is a contact form and you want to reach out and say nice things to an author, please do, because who uses those forms way more often? Men who are angry and want to get into your inbox. So it's really nice for people to balance the scales every now and again.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we begin there? What exactly is this thing called emotional labor, and how did you first become aware of it?
So this is a little bit of a tricky one, because I think within my book, we're talking really about invisible labor, which is both the mental load and emotional labor. And I think I conflate the two a little bit in the book. I think all of the points still stand, but I also think it's important to kind of separate out the different terminology here. And so when I talked in the book about emotional labor, I was talking about the mental load aspect, which is like you were listing before, like being the calendar keeper, being the person who notices what needs to be done, makes a plan for it, ensures that it gets done if you're not the person doing it, does all the follow-up, does the research. And so that kind of cognitive component of the labor. And then there is the emotional labor aspect, which is kind of being the person who takes the temperature of the mood in the room and adjusts behavior accordingly. And so if I were to, say, ask my husband to do a certain job that I want taken off my plate, and taken off my plate is actually not exactly how it works. If I want him to basically do the job while I oversee and make sure it gets done, I have to approach that with a certain tone, with a certain attitude. And that is something that reaches far beyond the home, because we learn how to adjust our emotional labor behaviors in workplaces, which is where it originated from Arlie Hochschild's work. We also do that, when responding to street harassment, when engaging with other men, engaging with people who we don't know if they're going to be a threat or not. And so we're really talking about these two different things here, and the ways that they interplay. But I think mostly when people think about my book, they're thinking about the mental load aspect of this work within the home, because that is usually the thing that leads people to be really fed up.
Right. Absolutely. So within that book, you lay out very nicely, I think, not only examples from your life, but also just general feelings, I guess, from friends that you had talked to or research that you had done. And something that I found out, I guess, after the fact, and maybe this was the starting point for you, you had a freelance writing article in Harper's Bazaar. I don't know how else to describe it. Maybe that's a blog or something like that, called Women Aren't Nags, We're Just Fed Up. And so I was curious how, that all started for you. Was that a feeling that you were having, or had you just been kind of taking a pulse on, conversations that, we have with friends and family and that kind of thing? What was the starting point for you? Because I think that article happened before you wrote your book, right?
Yes,
right?
that article was what brought the book into being. So that article in Harper's Bazaar went mega viral. I mean, hundreds of thousands of shares within a matter of weeks. It's what got an agent to reach out to me. Multiple agents reached out and were like, do you want to write a book on this? Because this is obviously going to be the big conversation that we're going to be having for a while. And I don't think we realized how long we'd still be having this conversation, because it's very relevant today. I'm still talking about this book all the time. And I think it's only grown in relevance since I wrote it in 2018. But the article that came out, I had no idea that it was going to, be such a cultural touch point. I was freelancing full time. And so I would write, maybe 5 to 10 articles a week sometimes. And so this was something that kind of yes, it was on my radar as an article that I was going to do that, had okay potential because an editor decided to accept it at a big magazine. But I did not anticipate the response that it was going to get. And it really changed the trajectory of my life. And it really was just based on, conversations that I had been having with friends, kind of keeping a pulse on what was happening in magazines. A big part of freelancing is kind of noticing what other things are in the cultural conversation and kind of pulling together those threads to say something new. And so I had actually written another article before this that sort of touched on this, but in a just parenting specific way. Nothing, crickets. It was for Romper. And then I had this piece that was much bigger and much more of a cultural touch point. And I think it's because I was finally able to name the piece of that resentment that happens. And be able to name, the thing that comes out most often from that article is the moment that I realized I don't want to have to tell you what to do. I want you to notice what needs to be done and do it. That idea of wanting a full partner and not to be a micromanager within your own home. And I think that was the thing that was oh, that's what strikes the chord. That's what gets this conversation rolling. And so while I didn't anticipate it, I can kind of look back in retrospect and say well, yeah, that was a big aha moment for a lot of people.
Absolutely. In fact, I've said this so many times to you before, relate that to my own journey. My ex-husband was well, I'm happy to help you if you would just leave me a list or tell me what you want me to help you with. And for me, I'm but you don't understand that it takes me time to write this list for you. And I just never understood, and maybe I never will understand why we are just so different in that aspect, where he can't notice that there's pink scum in the shower, around the bath, drain or whatever, socks need picked up off the floor, or dishes are on the counter, or crumbs are left over from the toaster, or whatever it is. And again, not trying to, maybe I was at some point, because yes, I feel like I have tendencies of perfectionism and I was innately born with that. But going back to the whole conversation of, I don't want to have to add something else to my plate so I can offload it. So yes, totally struck a chord with me as well when I did go back and read the article. So you hit something there for sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up like, oh, I have, like my perfectionist tendencies I was born with, and he just can't see the mess. And I think these are actually really deeply cultural. We are conditioned in these ways where that if someone were to walk into your house and see all of these messes, they're not going to look at your husband. They're not going to look at him and say like, oh, he's not doing a very good job. That even though, if you're trying to have an egalitarian marriage, it doesn't matter. Those social cues that you've picked up throughout your life tell you that's on you. I was talking about this the other day of like, when we have people coming over, what does my husband want to do? He wants to go outside and mow the lawn, because we know that that's a masculine coded job. And that's the thing that reflects on him. Whereas I'm like, no, the inside of the house needs to be clean for people to come over, because we femininely code that job. And so that is going to be a reflection on me, whether or not we want that to be true. We have these kind of subconscious patterns that we adhere to. And then we call it fate.
Yes. Or going back to your book, the chapter you had titled like, Who Cares? That was something that was the impetus of our fighting almost. It's like, well, you put too much pressure on yourself to have everything clean. And why are you even bothering to clean this if it's going to get dirty again? And when he said those words to me, it really hurt my feelings, because I'm like, I want our children to live in somewhat of a clean house. Like I don't want to be eating off of, dirty plates, and not that he does, but you know what I'm saying? It's like our level of what was acceptable was just completely on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so one of the things that I found interesting and strikingly relatable in that chapter was that you were, I guess, having an interview with CBC Radio, and the person interviewing you was like, have you ever been called a control freak before? And, I'm laughing to myself as I'm reading this, because I'm like, I guess I have been called a control freak before, but not because I'm trying to do it selfishly. It's because I want my family to have boundaries and a routine and order and somewhat of a cleanly environment. I wasn't intentionally trying to sabotage anyone or force my things on other people, but that's how it came across. And so, that also struck a nerve with me, to be called a control freak. So I related to that.
Yeah. Well, and the part I think that comes shortly after that is the fact that we don't arbitrarily set these standards, right? You're talking about like, well, I know why things need to be done in this order and in this way, because I have spent all of this time and energy and recalculation to make sure that this is what keeps my family comfortable and happy and moving forward. And so it's not like you're, asking them to set the table like the queen is coming over for dinner. You're making sure that the laundry is done so that there are clean clothes when it's time to go to a sports practice. These are not really a difference in standards. It's a difference in care and attention. And I think that's what we often miss. It's like, well, just lower your standards. No, it's not a need to lower standards. It's a need for everyone to be on the same page about what needs to get done in order for us to maintain the level of comfort that we have. And that is something that many men aren't willing to step up and do.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I might also add to that, I learned this from your book as well, that even though men may not be inherently conditioned to be, the caretaker, so to speak, like women obviously are more in tune to that. It has been since the start of humanity almost. Women are the ones that rear the kids, and the men are the ones who hunt and gather the food and come back with the paycheck and all the stuff. But that's not to say that they can't do it. And so when he and I got divorced, probably for the better part of 6-9 months, it was a complete shit show over there because he didn't know, obviously, what size the kids wore or who needed to be contacted for doctor's appointments and whatever. Name anything and everything under the sun, because I handled all of that. And so for me to have to take a step back and be like, well, I can't control what happens over there. That's on him, but he had to learn. And he's perfectly capable of doing it. I don't know if maybe I took that away from him because I was making everything perfect and comfortable instead of inviting him into the conversation and saying, hey, why don't you call the pediatrician today because they need a wellness visit or whatever it is. And so you do a very nice job in the book of making this an equal opportunity for all parties involved, that it shouldn't just fall back on one parent. It's, we created this family together. How are you stepping up to the plate?
Yeah. And I think, there is a difference between maternal gatekeeping, saying, I'm not going to allow you to touch any of this. And then you having to go through the extra step of saying like, oh, I know that this thing is coming up. What if I hand over that menial task to him? Rather than him knowing and anticipating those things. Because really, it's not about the task itself. It is about all of the cognitive planning labor that goes before what actually needs to be done.
Exactly.
And so it's, again, that list making, that takes a real toll on your time and your mental space and your energy.
Absolutely.
And I do agree that, there is a lot of social conditioning about what roles we were going to play in our marriages and in our families. And that conditioning starts really young. I mean, like younger than you think, like 3 years old is when you start to notice gender differences happening because of socialization. Mm-hmm. And so, when you've been groomed into this particular role for your whole life, and then you get to this point, midway in a marriage with kids, it is hard to change. That doesn't mean that those skills can't be learned. I often will compare this to learning French. We were in a French immersion program our whole lives. We speak it fluently. And it's not to say that men can't learn to speak French. It's just harder to do when you're not a native speaker. And so you're going to have a steeper learning curve. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It means that you have to be committed to putting in that effort. And I think that's where we often see that disconnect, is there's not the desire to put in that effort.
Yeah. I also might go as far as to say, is it something that you just have to tolerate with the other person? I mean, maybe that's an individual decision. Can you tolerate, or are we going to try to work on fixing this so everyone is happy to a degree? I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. However, I don't think it's something that should be accepted as well, this is my lot in life. I married someone, we went into this, not knowing that I would feel this way about all of this work. I don't think that's something that you have to accept. And so, something that I have been thinking about a lot lately is when there is that situation where you can't get divorced, because that is the reality for a lot of women, is divorce is expensive. It is risky. It is not something everyone can do. And so if you have a partner who is not going to step up and create change, you have to kind of do triage for yourself of deciding okay, well, how much of this am I going to keep? And where am I going to redirect whatever energy I take away from this relationship? Because if that's where you're at, you can take away energy from putting in that time to try to change your partner, because you can't change them. They have to want to change themselves. And you redistribute that into community and building a support system, and maybe getting yourself to that point where you can leave the relationship. Because I don't want anyone to feel continually trapped and then also without support. And so maybe that support system doesn't allow you to leave, but it allows you something else in your life to give focus and care and attention to that will come back to you. Whereas if you're in a relationship where there is no reciprocity, I don't want you wasting your time there.
Absolutely. Well, piggybacking off that thought, then let's talk about what the path forward might look like if both partners are willing to come to the table and have the hard conversations, because it's not something that changes overnight. As you even said in your book, it took you years to get there. Like, how did you even get here? It took you years to get there gradually till it blows up into this big storm where you're just like, wait a minute, what just happened the past however many years or months or whatever? So I know you've been asked this question probably tons of times, but on here for our listeners who haven't read your book yet, how do we create a culture of awareness so both parties are actively participating in this, where they can live and feel heard and come together in a more unified front?
Yeah. And, this is still a fun question to get, because I think it changes over time as I have more time in my relationship to see the way that things have shifted and changed. And, now we're looking at like 8 years since I was writing that book. And so a lot has changed, within my relationship and life since then. And I think about this a lot, like what were the steps that we took to change? Yeah. And the first part that you said there, the willingness, I think that is the first thing. You can't move forward without both partners being willing to change. And yes, both partners. A lot of the times I'm really good about saying, like, hold on to your standards, make sure that, like, because the first thing that usually needs to change is that your partner needs to substantially increase the amount of involvement and attention to detail that they're bringing into this. And I think at first I needed my husband to come up to my standard for a while until I felt safe enough to start letting things go, before I felt safe enough to know that important things wouldn't fall through the cracks. And that took a lot of time. I would say a couple of years before I felt like, okay, he's really in this. He's really going to show up every single day, doing the work, noticing, living up to the standards that we've set together. And then we were able to start to recalibrate from there. And so in the beginning, it was a lot of me like pointing out things that I resented that I didn't think were a big enough hill to die on, like the socks on the floor, like all of these little things that had been building up for years and years. And I kind of felt like for a long time I needed to pick my battles. And so, I told him in advance that I was going to do this. Like it was during the writing of a book, which made it a little bit more, I don't know, neutral, because I'm like, this is for the book. We're doing this for the book. Of like, okay, I'm gonna start like pointing out the things. Like there's gonna be a lot of them. It's gonna feel nitpicky. I promise I'm not doing this in a way to like be angry with you or to, do this out of spite. Like these are things that have actually bothered me for a long time that I've kind of like pushed down, just to keep the peace, again, that emotional labor part. And he started to notice, started to do more things. I will say years later, I don't know that he's learned to, I'll say this, he's learned to notice better. And there are many things that he would not naturally notice unless he put reminders for himself. So we learned, way down the line that my husband was late diagnosed with ADHD, which a lot of people bring that into this conversation. And like, well, what about that? What about neurotypical differences? It's still your responsibility to show up and to find methods that work for you. And so for him, that's a lot of notes, reminders, things that help him to show up in that way. Whereas like my brain is like, okay, I'm going to notice everything and then just like systematically get it done because I'm used to holding all of this in my brain. And so I think it's a lot of open communication. I'm getting a little bit into the nitty gritty of our situation, but I think it's,
It's helpful.
Being willing to have open communication, being willing to shift over time, because the standards aren't going to stay the same. Your season of life is not going to stay the same. And so like you have to constantly have that communication. You need to be open to flexibility and change. And both partners need to remain in it. I think it's really easy to do one big push of saying like, oh, I'm going to make all these changes. Well, what happens when someone gets sick? what happens when there's a job change? What happens when we reach the holidays? And there's a lot more mental and emotional labor to be done there than there normally is. It's a really long-term commitment that you're making to your relationship.
For sure. I love that. You had touched on something, I guess, twice now about how things shift kind of over time. And going back to your first book, Fed Up, I hinted at the beginning that you're working on, your second big book. And now that you're in this review phase, do you want to share, or can you share a sneak peek of what's to come in this book, what you've learned, I guess, since Fed Up, and if there's any new information that has come to light to you that you're like, oh, okay, no, this is how we connect the dots there. Or maybe that information has changed into something else. So I'm curious if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So the next book is called No One Loves an Angry Woman: On Faith, Culture, and Feminine Rage. And something that I talk about in Fed Up is about our upbringings. And so I was raised in an evangelical community, like a very small Christian school. And I am starting to relate in this book a lot of the ways that Christian culture and patriarchy seeps its way into mainstream culture. And so when we're talking about, to go back to earlier in our conversation about that gender essentialism of like, well, I am just naturally this way, and he is just naturally this way. And that kind of division that we hold as very normal in the mainstream conversation is actually deeply rooted in Christian patriarchy and the idea that men and women have very separate roles within society, within faith. And so I'm kind of connecting my evangelical upbringing with a lot of the cultural reporting that I've done over the years in the feminist space. It's been a really, I don't want to say fun. It's not a fun read, I promise. But it's been a very fulfilling project for me. It's helped me to kind of heal a lot of these internal patriarchal narratives that have kind of ran the show without me knowing and recognizing for many years. And I think that's what I hope that this next book helps other women do. I hope it helps them, whether they have been, in church their whole lives and are deconstructing, or if you have never set foot in a church, like I promise that you will see yourself in here. Mm-hmm. And hopefully it will help you deconstruct some of those internalized patriarchal narratives that are running the show without you knowing it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I also just want to kind of like set the record straight too, in case anyone thinks otherwise, that, at least from what I've taken from the book, you do a really good job of trying to see both sides of the equation. Like you can't help how you were raised, like that's just how it goes. And so it's not like this big male bashing of like, oh, well, men don't ever help and women are always doing everything. Like you do a really good job of saying, hey, well, we have things that we can work on too. So I just want to throw that out there too, that you do put an equal amount of time and effort into researching both sides of that equation. So it's out there.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if the next book, the same can be said. I mean, But also, I think within the book, I am not necessarily talking about men so much as I am talking about religion and patriarchal structures. I think when we're taking a look at individual men, it looks very different than a religious institution and the kind of rules and things that like harm not only women, but men as well. And that's something I talk about in Fed Up. Like, if you're not going to take any stock in your life, if you're not going to do the mental labor, the emotional labor, be fully involved in your life, like you're living a half life. You're not creating skills to have healthy relationships, not just with your partner, but with your friends, with your family. Kin keeping is a big part of the mental load equation and invisible labor. Like, are you reaching out to your brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and friends and family? That's one of the big reasons that men die earlier, especially after divorce, because they don't maintain their own social networks. This work is a big part of that. And so when I'm talking in my next book about like the ways that Christian patriarchy harms, it really harms men as well, in far more ways than I think we recognize.
Yeah. What were some of the ways that you and Rob came together to talk about the division of labor and how you were going to try to make it more equal? I mean, I think I had read somewhere that, there was a spreadsheet at some point made, but what tools did you use to kind of divide and conquer all of that, or at least have a big picture so you can visually see, okay, this is really out of balance here?
Yes, I did make like the spreadsheet of different mental tasks and physical tasks that happen. I don't think we went about it systematically, and I don't think I recommend that in any way. Because of the shifting nature of life, and because that, kind of separates communication. So say you're going to just like divide up the tasks and be like, you're in charge of this and you're in charge of this. It might be efficient looking at it in a business sense, but like your marriage is not a corporation. Right. Your relationship is not a corporation. I don't think that's the way that we should approach life. Yeah. And so I think it's a much more fluid conversation of like, for me and my husband, we're looking at like, okay, well, what's coming up in the week ahead? Like, who is going to be in charge of dinner on what nights, depending on who's home with which children? Because, we've got 3 kids that are in elementary, middle, and high school. We are all over the place right now. It is a very like high stakes time. And so like, who is doing what really depends on the day of the week and what it looks like for each of us. And so it's much more fluid than, okay, well, we're going to divide this up. And, like you've got a lot on your plate this week. Too bad. That's still your job. That's not how either of us approach these conversations. And I feel like having that grace for our humanity and our shifting energy is really necessary, because it is not, a corporate division. It is really like a relationship with someone that you should care deeply about.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. If there's anything that you would like to share with our listeners that we haven't talked about, any words of wisdom, what would those be? Last minute.
I mean, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think something that I've thought about a lot over the past couple of years that was not even on my radar as I was writing the book is that, we kind of move from this individual place of like, okay, well, I'm fed up. What do I need to do to change? And then we look to our partner and say like, okay, well, what do they need to do to change and kind of like make things work better for us? And then usually what we jump right to is like, okay, and then there are systemic changes that need to happen, which is true. And there are plenty of them. I think we miss that there is community building in between partnership and systemic change. One thing I've really noticed over the years and being in this busy season is that I really need to be able to rely on community in order to have the energy for both of us to have the energy to pursue any sort of systemic change. So any sort of activist work that needs to happen can only happen if we look outside the nuclear family as our only structure of support. Because like we can't make systemic change happen quickly. Like it is just a long and frustrating and slow process. But the more that we are able to tap into community to make a good life that actually feels supportive, the more we'll be able to lean towards systemic change and doing the activist work necessary so that parents actually have the support they need, because that is a huge part of why the mental load is such a, specifically US based like problem. We struggle a lot more with the mental load than other countries. And I can say that having toured around the world with my book, we are uniquely bad at this because we don't have the structural supports that parents need.
Why do you think anger and resentment build up so much then? Is it because of the lack of community? Is it because we don't have the outlet to kind of let it out? Like, what's the cause or the root that you've found that creates this anger and resentment?
I think what causes the resentment is a devaluing of our work. It's that not only that our work isn't being seen, but when we do bring it up and you say like, hey, I need you to see this work. I need you to come into this work with me. It's devalued, right? Like, well, it's just not that important to me. You're doing too much. You should just, chill out and stop being such a control freak. It's such a dismissive narrative that we often get from our partners. And I realize that when you do have a partner who's willing to join in with you, you can start to turn that anger outward towards the systems that actually need to change. And so I think, for me and my husband, now that we are a united front, that anger gets to go in a different direction, in a much more productive direction for me. And I really want to see more of us be able to enter that space.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, you are definitely on the path to helping create that, Gemma. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing your thoughts on this, and can't wait to get firsthand dibs on this new book. So
yes. Yeah. No One Loves an Angry Woman on Faith, Culture, and Feminine Rage. That's going to come out on September 1st of 2026. So it's a ways away, but it'll be here before you know
That's
it.
That's right. The anticipation. Can't wait. So where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
You can find me on Substack. It's No One Loves an Angry Woman. And you can find me on Instagram. It's at Gemma L. Hartley. Those are the main two that I'm on. There's also Facebook or my website, gemmahartley.com. If you're a writer looking for a writing coach, I'm currently taking clients for 2026. That's only going to be available for, a few weeks into January. But if anyone is interested in that, through Instagram or through my website.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gemma.
Yeah, thank you.